I'm kinda known among Christians for saying, if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, and flies like a duck, then it's probably a duck. The same principle applies to Jesus. If his story walks like a myth, talks like a myth, and ascends to the heavens like a myth, then it's likely mythological. This isn't a flimsy association fallacy. It's the duck test, a straightforward principle of reasoning rooted in abductive logic. But first, let's clarify what we mean by myth. Scholars define myths as narratives that use symbolic and often supernatural elements to explain the world, convey cultural values, or express religious beliefs or sacred ideas. These stories are fictive, not historical records, and typically aim to inspire or teach rather than document mundane events. Similarly, legends are semi-historical accounts that blur the line between fact and fiction, often exaggerating the lives of historical figures to heroic or divine proportions. When I refer to the Jesus story as myth, I mean it contains elements of fiction crafted within this genre, not an account of mundane facts that occurred in the real world. Inferential cognitive reasoning helps us cut through the noise and make sense of the world by recognizing patterns. When you see a red light, you know it means stop. This isn't up for debate. It's universally understood, even before you take a driving course. Ancient authors had their own signals when crafting stories about demigods, and these language cues directed ancient readers to their relationship to their correct, explicit interpretation. Now picture a man in gray shorts, a collared gray shirt, carrying a bag full of mail, walking up to your mailbox. You instantly conclude he's the mailman. Could he be an imposter? Sure, but that's a stretch when all the signs scream mailman. The same logic applies to stories of demigods in the Greco-Roman world. Miraculous births, divine fathers, epic feats, and ascensions to heaven? These aren't random quirks. They're the uniform of mythology and legend. Romulus, Heracles, Asclepius, they all wear it proudly. So why, when Jesus shows up in the same outfit, performing the same routine, do apologists insist he's different? It's not an association fallacy. It's recognizing the obvious, common sense. Cognitive reasoning leads us to the most fixed conclusion. Jesus, like the others, unmistakably joins the list of recognized demigods in classical antiquity. Let's compare Jesus to other well-documented myths and legends from antiquity. Asclepius, the divine healer, not only raised the dead, but was seen by many eyewitnesses after his own death. The Caesars, after their deifications, they were reported to appear to travelers on Roman roads, just as Jesus appeared to his disciples on the road to Emmaus. Romulus ascended into the heavens and returned to instruct the Romans on sacred rites, echoing Jesus' commissioning of his followers after his resurrection. Dionysus transformed water into wine. My last documentary shows this. Performed other miracles and was celebrated for his divine epiphanies, just like Jesus. Heracles descended into Hades and returned victorious, his story blending human heroism with divine intervention. Not only did Heracles descend into Hades, but so did Dionysus, saving his own mother's soul from the underworld. Jesus did the same. Alexander the Great was proclaimed the son of Zeus Ammon, his divinity underscored by miraculous signs and eyewitness accounts. His body also did not see decay, just like Jesus. These figures, like Jesus, were surrounded by miraculous claims, post-death appearances, and exaltation to divine status. these elements are consistent with the mythic and legendary genres, not history. The New Testament doesn't just resemble these mythic traditions, it reflects them. 2025 is here, and like most of you, I've set some goals, but I'm keeping them very simple this year. Whether it's hitting the gym, going on more walks, or calling my loved ones more often, I've got a secret to keep me motivated. Raycon Everyday Earbuds. These earbuds are my perfect gym buddy. With premium audio and up to 32-hour battery life, they're always ready to go, just like me. Plus, the multi-point connectivity lets me seamlessly switch from my workout playlist on my phone to answering phone calls on my laptop. It's a game changer. And the color? Well, I chose black, as you could see. It's sleek, modern, and goes with everything. Honestly, it's the most elegant option I've seen in earbuds. The IP66 rating means they're weatherproof, dustproof, and sweat resistant for in the gym, walks, things like that. Perfect for Florida's unpredictable weather. Oh, and the quick charge function, just 10 minutes of charging gives me an extra 1.5 hours of listening. 10 minutes. Active noise cancellation and awareness mode let me focus on my favorite podcasts while I'm keeping an ear out for the kids. Honestly, these are more than earbuds. They're an everyday essential. So why not make your 2025 easier and more fun with Raycon Everyday Earbuds? They even come with a 30-day happiness guarantee. No questions asked. Go to buyraycon.com/MythVision for 20% off site-wide. Click the link in the description to grab yours now. There's also a pinned comment. Jesus' miraculous birth, his descent into death and resurrection, his appearances to followers, and his exaltation to divine status through the clouds in his ascension are classic elements of myth-making. To claim that Jesus' story is unique and historical, while dismissing Asclepius, Romulus, Dionysus, and the Caesars as myths, is special pleading. An inconsistent application of reasoning designed to exempt one figure from the same rules applied to others. By defining myth as fictive and symbolic, we can assess Jesus' story through a scholarly lens. As scholars like Robert Siegel have noted, myths are narratives, quote, not meant to be believed as fact, but meant to convey truths about the human condition and divine power, end quote. The Gospels, steeped in mythic patterns, walk, talk, and ascend like myths. If every other figure with similar elements is categorized as myth or legend, then the Jesus story fits that category as well. The simplest explanation, the one that doesn't require special pleading, is that the Jesus narrative is not history, but part of a long tradition of mythological storytelling. The evidence quacks loudly, and it's unmistakable. Jesus' story is legend, not fact. There was a time when I was absolutely certain that angels and demons were everywhere, pulling the strings of my everyday life. I wasn't just a believer, I was a warrior for God. Casting out demons, speaking in tongues, and prophesying were regular parts of my reality. But as time went on, my faith took me deeper into theology, where I journeyed through various branches of Christianity, starting with Calvary Chapel and eventually landing in the PCA Reformed Calvinist groups. My obsession with eschatology, end times theology, led me to partial preterism, the belief that most New Testament prophecies were fulfilled in the first century, particularly with the destruction of Herod's temple in 70 AD. Influenced by thinkers like Kenneth Gentry, Gary DeMar, and R.C. Sproul, I became convinced that Jesus' prophesied return was still future, but it kinda already happened, symbolically as a type or shadow of what was to come in the historical reality of Jerusalem's fall. But then I went even further. I embraced full preterism, the so-called heresy that claims all biblical prophecy, including the resurrection, final judgment, and the creation of a new heaven and earth, was fulfilled in the first century. Full preterists argue that the climactic return of Jesus happened in 70 AD, albeit symbolically, other than maybe Ed Stevens types of full preterist, and that Paul and Jesus' time-bound predictions were spot on, if only understood spiritually. It made sense at the time, especially with passages like, "Truly, I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Matthew 16:28. When you're in the faith bubble, admitting Jesus could have been wrong isn't even an option. You're forced into one of four mental gymnastics routines. 1. Jesus was right. It did happen, but we misunderstood how. 2. Jesus was wrong. He missed the mark, making him a false prophet. 3. Jesus was right. Those urgent time statements don't actually mean anything, so we're still waiting, thousands of years later. 4. Jesus was right. It didn't happen because the sinners failed to cooperate. The delay is humanity's fault. This conditional view has taken prominence in some apologetic circles right now. At the time, I couldn't accept that Jesus might have been wrong, but then I began studying biblical scholarship and realized how much of the New Testament was likely written after the events it prophesies. It wasn't prophecy at all. It was history framed as foresight, a classic storytelling device to make Jesus look infallible. This realization shook me, but it wasn't the last step in my journey. Slowly, my faith crumbled as I ventured into comparative mythology. Looking back now, I see the New Testament differently, filled with failed prophecy, and for those who spiritualize it, as full preterists do, it feels meaningless. The climax of all human history supposedly ends with God killing his own chosen people, the Jews, in Jerusalem, and that's it? That's the final judgment? Nothing tangible to hope for? It all seems like empty rhetoric, hollowed out by realization that what once felt divine is just human. But this isn't about my denominational shifts or theological changes. It's about something far deeper. The relentless accusation that I was, quote, tossed back and forth by the waves, end quote. Fellow Christians weaponized that verse against me, claiming I was spiritually immature. What struck me was their unshakable confidence in their positions, Catholic, Baptist, Lutheran, or otherwise, while they all disagreed with each other, screaming loud. Now looking back, I can sincerely ask, who's to say the author of Ephesians wasn't full of it? Engaging in their own cunning and deceitful scheming, my pursuit of truth demanded I question everything, even the faith I once held as the way, the truth, and the life. As I mentioned in my last video, my journey took me initially through Acharya-esque style mythicism, like what's portrayed in Zeitgeist. I flirted with the idea that the Bible is essentially astrotheology, where Jesus represents the sun surrounded by the 12 zodiac signs, disciples, ushering in the age of Pisces. This seemed fascinating, but ultimately felt simplistic the more I learned. When I would go back to the primary sources, many things didn't check out. From there, I gravitated towards rigorous thinkers, scholars who questioned Jesus' historicity, but engaged in actual research. These scholars pointed me to countless academics who, while agreeing that Jesus was mythologized, saw him as a historical figure. They showed how historical people like the Caesars, Apollonius of Tyana, or even ancient philosophers, Pythagoras, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, the list goes on, had their lives exaggerated into legend. This made the most sense to me. I became a historicist, believing Jesus likely existed, but was heavily mythologized based on what made the most sense to me. Crazy how I went from strongly thinking this guy Jesus was God in the flesh to possibly not existing at all, to now thinking, okay, there was likely a dude, but is it even possible to know what he said and actually did? Wouldn't you know it? Those scholars who agree that there was a historical Jesus all argue over the sayings of Jesus, not agreeing over exactly which sayings really go back to the charismatic teacher, and which were invented by the gospel authors. It seemed futile to have extreme confidence over what this guy said and did, with various accounts also giving us completely different takes. The 4 different gospels, as an example. That's not counting the ones outside of the Bible. The mythicist and apologist camps seemed simplistic to me and easier to swallow instead of imagining a much messier picture. Now here's where it gets tricky. I caught flack from both camps. As a historicist, mythicists mocked me for selling out or called me an apologist, while apologists accused me of being a conspiracy nut when I was still a mythicist and found every excuse to dismiss anything I might say, just like they do today. The moral of the story: who cares what others think? Follow the evidence. My journey has upset plenty of people, and I expect it will continue to do so. But I'm not here to please everyone. I'm here to follow where reason and evidence lead. Mythicists often claim the entire New Testament is fabricated, a wholesale invention cobbled together from earlier myths and other historical figures. While this isn't true of all mythicists, there's no denying the inventive nature of much of the New Testament. Apologists, on the other hand, insist every word in the New Testament is historical. They bend themselves over backwards to harmonize contradictions and rationalize away obvious storytelling elements. When I point out striking similarities between the Gospels or Bible at large and ancient myths, creation stories, flood myths, dying and rising deities, Greco-Roman translation fables, the apologists cry foul. They whip out the red card of logical fallacies, accusing me of committing the association fallacy. But scholars have long recognized that the literature across the world, including the Bible, shares mythic genres and motifs. The New Testament is no exception. This is where the major divide lies. Apologists fight tooth and nail to defend the historical reliability of everything in the New Testament, even if it means turning obvious legends into history. Skeptics push back, trying to separate fact from fiction. My goal isn't to win a war of egos. I want the truth. And that means understanding Christian literature within its historical and cultural context, without dismissing the myths and legends that shaped it. So let's compare. As I told Michael Jones in my previous video, if Jesus truly turned water into wine, Dionysus far outperformed him. He turned springs, rivers, and even ship vessels into wine. These epiphanies were documented long before Jesus and occurred annually, stretching back to the classical Greek period, continuing even long after Jesus. If we're opening the door to the miraculous, why aren't they being consistent? Why dismiss Dionysus' miracles as myth while insisting Jesus' miracles are history? The apologists accuse me of being closed-minded, but their willingness to entertain miracles stops at their own sacred text. I'm not fabricating these connections. Serious scholars in the field have recognized the parallels between Jesus and Dionysus. To those who quickly dismiss this, I say, keep reading, my friends. Jesus parallels much more than just Dionysus, so buckle up. Let's apply some common sense. How many virgins do you know who've been impregnated by a god? How many people have you seen walking on water, multiplying food to feed thousands from a few loaves and fish? What about dying a violent death, being buried for 3 days, and then coming back to life? Oh, And don't forget, hanging around for 40 days before ascending into heaven. Can anyone point to even one verified example of these things happening in the real world outside of myths, legends, or folklore? Go ahead, I'll wait. Now compare this with something more mundane. Shipwrecks. Ships sink all the time. Around the time the Titanic sank, several other major vessels went down too. And here's the kicker. 14 years before the Titanic tragedy, an author published a novel called The Wreck of the Titan, about an unsinkable ship striking an iceberg, sinking, and killing a lot of people. Sound familiar? It should. The similarities are eerie, but nobody is claiming the Titan caused the Titanic. Why? Because we have real-world examples of ships sinking to contextualize the events. But here's where the apologists get it wrong. They accuse me of committing an association fallacy when I compare Jesus' miracles to those of other gods and heroes. They argue, Derek, you're saying the fictional Titan is the same as the historical Titanic. Actually, no. That's a straw man. What I'm saying is that Jesus' miraculous birth, resurrection, and ascension all share patterns with other myths and legends, and unlike shipwrecks, we don't have real-world examples of people walking on water, turning water into wine, or rising from the dead. So I don't see a historical Titanic in what I see as legend in Jesus. No one that matters today is arguing the historical Titanic tragedy was a legend, invented and was made up by looking at the countless other novels, which is very similar. Have the apologists ever seriously taken the time to think through why many critical scholars see much of the story of Jesus as legend? An association fallacy occurs when you wrongly assume that because two things are similar, they must share the same origin or truth. For example, someone might claim the Bible describes Moses parting the Red Sea, and other ancient myths describe heroes parting rivers or seas. Therefore, the story of Moses must have been copied directly from those myths. This is an association fallacy. While parting waters is a dramatic motif found in multiple cultures, it doesn't automatically mean the biblical account was borrowed directly from these stories, for instance, or even necessarily fall into the same category of myth. In Greek mythology, Jason and the Argonauts encounter Triton, the sea god, who parts the waters to create a path for their ship to safely return home. In Hindu mythology, Vishnu is said to have split the waters during his cosmic exploits to establish order in the universe. In Mesopotamian mythology, the god Marduk defeats the chaos goddess Tiamat, splitting her body to form the heavens and the seas, symbolizing divine mastery over water and chaos. While these stories share the imagery of divided waters, such motifs could independently arise as metaphors for divine power or victory over nature. The similarities alone don't prove one story directly borrowed from the other. It's likely these themes do stem from shared cultural narratives passed along over time. Scholars have noticed, in case you didn't know, the creation language in the Moses narrative of splitting the sea to that of Genesis 1, where God separates the waters from waters with a divine command, dry land appears, and he's taming chaos. The Genesis creation or even flood myth has been argued by scholars to being inspired by earlier Mesopotamian creation and flood stories for several reasons. Specifically with Genesis, there are several reasons, and scholars have noted, on its potential dependence on the earlier myths of the Enuma Elish and Gilgamesh epic. One of those is the primordial waters. In one case, you have a deity, a goddess, Tiamat, being destroyed by Marduk, the chief deity. He tears her carcass, being watery in nature, and ends up building the firmament and creating the heavens and earth from her body. This is, as some scholars noted, Tahom in Genesis 1:2, and this idea of chaos and bringing order. There's also separation of waters bringing forth dry land, as we see in the Enuma Elish as well as in Genesis. There are several differences, and you usually get this with the apologist. They want to highlight the differences only to somehow divorce it from having a similar mythological genre, as if we're not dealing with the same category of myth. Now, if one wanted to die on the hill of no dependence on Gilgamesh, no dependence on the Enuma Elish, you could still identify the genre. This is not an association fallacy, but I wanted to highlight several scholars have noted the similarities between, for example, the Adapa myth with the eating and drinking of immortality and the trickery of Ea, Enki, and Adapa when he goes up to Anu after breaking the south wind's wings. You also have the ziggurat epics with Babel meaning confused, which is where we get the idea of the confusion of tongues in Genesis 11-ish area. Now here's what's really, really fascinating to me. Once you add up what's going on in Genesis 1 through 11, and you notice even in the genealogies of Genesis 5 and then later with the Tower of Babel scene with Noah's sons, you also have recognition by scholars of the Sumerian kings list. So yes, you have a respin, a reworked model of earlier mythologies. With the flood, yeah, you have a cube with Gilgamesh. It's not the same shape as an ark flood of a boat that we see in Noah. However, there's 3 birds that are released, and after the flood, in both cases, Utnapishtim, however you want to pronounce that name, is sacrificing to the gods, and they promise not to do this again, just like we see with Yahweh in Genesis. So, if you don't want to say that they're dependent, or in some way culturally recognizing this, which I don't see how you wouldn't see that, you could still identify this as mythology. To argue that that's an association fallacy is going to argue that we aren't recognizing genre motifs that are easily recognizable in any other narrative. This is where the special pleading comes in and why no one takes this serious amongst serious scholars who study this material. They see the characteristics and enough of them to recognize what we're dealing with. To add icing on the cake back there where we were talking about Moses and the splitting of the Red Sea, if you will. Red Sea, Reed Sea, people always have different names for this. Joshua Bowen writes in his Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament about Bernard Bateau, and he says he recently argued for a mythological understanding of the Suf Sea. He writes, quote, "The Reed Sea hypothesis is flawed and must be given up. Yam Suf should thus be translated as the Sea of End. That is, it is the last sea, the sea situated at the edge of creation." Bateau's argument is complex and deals with the mythological connections between different aspects of the Exodus narrative and other ancient Near Eastern mythologies. Academics do this stuff, and I love it, because there's nothing wrong with attempting to see, is there some type of correlation or connections, even culturally, between these mythologies? And some go so far as to even possibly link them genealogically. If we agree that the stories of Marduk, Jason, or other mythic figures are clearly mythical, and then point out that Moses' story shares many of the same elements, divine intervention, parting waters, supernatural feats, it's reasonable to categorize Moses' story as mythological. This is because you're identifying common traits within a genre rather than asserting direct borrowing. To frame it, association fallacy, the story of Moses parting the Red Sea must have been copied directly from Marduk splitting Tiamat because they both involve splitting. A valid inductive argument, the story of Moses parting the Red Sea shares many elements with well-established myths about divine figures splitting water, which suggest it is also part of the mythological genre. When evaluating the Gospels or the Hebrew Bible, scholars often use this type of inductive reasoning to explore how texts reflect mythological patterns, rather than claiming direct borrowing in every case. If shared elements indicate a shared genre, it is not an association fallacy. It's a thoughtful analysis of literary and cultural patterns. As this series unravels video after video, pay attention. We will identify legendary and mythic themes in the Bible, highlighting its unhistorical nature in these scenes, even if we aren't going to argue direct copying or genetic connections between different myths and the biblical stories. However, when it comes to Jesus and other ancient deities like Dionysus, the parallels go beyond surface-level coincidences. Scholars, not Derek Lambert only, scholars have shown that the gospel writers operated in a cultural milieu steeped in mythic traditions. Stories of divine births, miracle-working heroes, and ascending gods were part of the literary and religious landscape. Recognizing these shared patterns isn't an association fallacy. It's an acknowledgement of the mythic framework the gospel authors used. And in some cases, scholars make strong cases where they think there are antecedents in other legends or even myths that inspired the gospel telling of the stories of Jesus. We will highlight scholars along the way who are doing both. Now let's address the elephant in the room: special pleading. Apologists insist that Jesus' miracles are unique and historical, while dismissing the miraculous claims of every other culture as myth. Why? If Jesus is the Titanic of miracles, how do we explain the countless Titan stories that came before him? How do we distinguish between history and fiction? Eyewitness claims, Derek. We have historical eyewitness claims of people seeing Jesus and experiencing him after he died and rose again, vindicating the historical Titanic of Jesus, and the other Titan fictions don't. Romulus vanished into a storm, only to reappear to Proculus Julius, proclaiming his divine ascent and promising his protection over Rome. Asclepius, the god of healing, continued to mend the sick and comfort the suffering through visions and dreams in his sacred temples. Vespasian, the emperor, restored sight to the blind and healed the crippled, his miracles attested by astonished eyewitnesses. Hercules, consumed by flames, ascended to Olympus, his immortality confirmed by those who saw him rise to join the gods, and his bones missing from the ashes. Alexander the Great, preserved in incorruptible splendor, not allowing his body to decay, was said to walk in dreams, his spirit guiding the faithful even in death. Dionysus, the god of wine, manifested at his festivals, filling empty cauldrons with wine and transforming streams into rivers of his divine drink. His miracles witnessed year after year. Apollonius of Tyana, the sage and miracle worker, appeared to his disciples after death, his divine nature revealed to those who doubted. Theseus, the Athenian hero, led his people to victory at Marathon, his special presence rallying their forces. Zalmoxis, the Thracian god, returned from death after 3 years, his reappearance a promise of immortality for his followers. Osiris, torn apart and resurrected, appeared in sacred sites and rites, offering hope of eternal life. Even Mithras, the savior of Roman legions, was seen ascending to the heavens, his divine presence reaffirmed in secret ceremonies. The Caesars, too, joined the ranks of the divine. Julius Caesar's soul was seen rising to the heavens in the form of a comet, while Augustus was declared a god upon his death, his apotheosis affirmed by eyewitnesses, with Numerius Atticus, a senator and ex-praetor, swearing that he had seen Augustus ascending to heaven. Their divine appearances didn't stop there. Roman roads became stages for post-death sightings of these deified emperors. Travelers claimed to encounter Julius Caesar, Augustus, or Vespasian walking the roads of the empire, their divine presence ensuring Rome's continued glory. These encounters were taken as evidence of their enduring protection, their spirits alive and watching over the empire. And yet, we're told that Jesus' story is totally different. His resurrection, they claim, is a unique historical event, while Romulus, Asclepius, Dionysus, and the Caesars are dismissed as mere myths or fabrications. But this line of thinking reeks of special pleading, an arbitrary exemption for the New Testament from the very mythic patterns it so clearly mirrors. If Jesus appeared on the road to Emmaus, as the Gospels say, why is it unreasonable to believe the Caesars appeared on Roman roads as attested by their worshippers? Either Jesus and his devotees shared the same mythic experience as these other figures, or the Gospels are a continuation of this timeless tradition of divine appearances. The Gospels do not exist in isolation. They echo the same motifs: miraculous ascensions, divine manifestations, and eyewitness testimonies that filled the ancient world. To insist that Jesus' story is a historical one while dismissing Romulus, Asclepius, the Caesars, and others as legends is to ignore the broader narrative of human storytelling. If Jesus' story walks like a myth, talks like a myth, and gathers eyewitnesses like a myth, then it's not the singular exception apologists claim. The truth is, the New Testament shares far more with myth, legend, and folklore than it does with historical records. Ancient authors like Cicero and Lucian were quick to mock historians who mixed fables with fact. Cicero criticized those who exaggerated stories for political or religious agendas, while Lucian ridiculed people who blindly accepted tall tales as truth. Yet here we are, expected to believe that walking on water and rising from the dead are exceptions to the rule. If it walks like a duck, legend; talks like a duck, legend; and flies like a duck, legend. Maybe, just maybe, it's a duck, legend. Let's pause and really take in what the apologists want you to accept. Unlike real-world events like shipwrecks, which can be contextualized and verified, they expect you to believe that the New Testament, brimming with extraordinary and miraculous claims, documents literal history. Yet for every similar claim outside of their sacred texts, they'll dismiss it as fiction, a clever illusion, or outright deception. This is why voices like Lucian of Samosata resonate so strongly with me. Writing in the 2nd century AD, Lucian skewered humanity's gullibility with his biting wit. He had no patience for charlatans or the eager masses who lopped up their tails. Take this gem. The crowd is always ready to believe the extraordinary, and when the extraordinary runs short, they make it up. Lucian understood how easily people accepted fantastical stories, especially when they align with their hopes and desires. When reality fails to provide miracles, they simply invent them. Sound familiar? Or this: it is not surprising that men who feign miracles and claim divine inspiration attract followers, for the human race, by nature, loves to be deceived in matters of religion. Here Lucian lays bare how charismatic figures manipulate human credulity, turning mundane events into miraculous legends. Followers amplify these stories, and soon enough, the miracles take on lives of their own. Even when the truth is clear, people prefer the fable, for it is more comforting to believe the gods walk among us than to admit we are alone. Lucian saw this pattern everywhere. A daring tale grows into a legend, and the legend elevates the hero into a god. Sound like someone we know? What begins as a man's tale of daring grows into a legend of impossible deeds, until the hero is no longer a man, but a god. Even in death, the myth-making doesn't stop. In The Passing of Peregrinus, Lucian describes a philosopher who, like Jesus, faced his death with drama and flair. He cast himself into the fire, and the crowd, not content with his vanity, declared they saw his soul ascend to the heavens, as if it were Heracles himself. And afterward, when the man died, they said he had been a god all along, and his miracles, which had been mocked in life, became sacred truths in death. Lucian understood how easily people spin stories into sacred narratives. As he joked, they tell of rivers that speak, lions that write poetry, and men who rise from the dead. And yet, when you laugh at these tales, they call you impious. Clearly, I need to do a deep dive into Lucian someday, but who knows, maybe I'm just his reincarnation. It's doubtful the Gospels were ever intended to be read as literal history. If we try to squeeze them into that category, Lucian himself would have felled them for dishonesty. He critiqued those who exaggerated events for religious or political agendas, writing, "History is often written not by truth-tellers, but by flatterers who inflate the deeds of the great with divine favor, so that the living may command the reverence of the dead." It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than to persuade an apologist that most of Jesus' life, at least as told in the Gospels, is legendary, not historical. I've sold all my apologetic mental property and now hold a consistent position about ancient sources. My hope is that this miracle of clarity will happen to others too. I want you to carefully look at these parallels again with me. In these parallels, is there anything that stands out that sounds ridiculous? It all sounds kind of non-fictional. Is it likely that the Titan fiction is an invented story based off of someone's real-world reality and knowledge of real things that really take place? It's not like the ship is flying to the moon or some really outlandish thing that you would question. Anyone with common sense would question. Now let's dig into the wreck of the Titan. Morgan Robertson, who wrote the novel 14 years before the Titanic sank, wasn't some prophet. He had first-hand knowledge of maritime life. His father, Andrew Robertson, was a ship captain, exposing Morgan to the ins and outs of shipbuilding, navigation, and life at sea. Morgan himself served in the U.S. Merchant Marine, which gave him an intimate understanding of the technological innovations of his time. The concept of an unsinkable ship wasn't unique to his novel. It was a widely held belief about modern ocean liners in his day. The parallels between the Titan and the Titanic don't stem from divine foresight, but from Robertson's expertise and awareness of maritime trends, including the hubris surrounding practically unsinkable ships. Scholars have long noted that these similarities are better explained by Robertson's knowledge of ship design and his skill as a writer than by any supernatural premonition. Bottom line, real-world experience shaped his fiction, not divine inspiration. And here's the stark contrast. While Robertson's knowledge explains the Titanic parallels, what explains the resurrection, virgin births, and miraculous ascensions in the New Testament? Where are the contemporary real-world parallels? Why do all of these claims fall squarely into the category of myth, legend, and folklore? The apologists want us to believe that the New Testament, which walks like a legend, talks like a legend, and flies like a legend, somehow isn't a legend. But if it quacks like a duck, you know what it is. Unless God is trying to confuse and trick people like you and me. Let's take a moment to really think about what the apologists are asking us to believe. Unlike the real-world context of shipwrecks, they insist that the miraculous claims in the New Testament, virgin births, resurrections, and divine ascensions are historical events. Yet they casually dismiss every similar story outside the Bible as fiction, illusion, or outright fraud. This double standard is glaring, especially when we consider how the gospel authors were clearly influenced by the cultural myths and legends of their time, from Jewish to Greco-Roman. Take the novel The Wreck of the Titan, for example. Its author, Morgan Robertson, based his story on real-world maritime advancements and trends of his day. Similarly, the gospel authors crafted their narratives within a cultural landscape brimming with well-known myths and folklore. If apologists insist the New Testament's miraculous claims are unique and historical, they need to argue that these myths and legends, which share so many thematic similarities, also happened historically. Spoiler alert, they won't. But what if we take this a step further? Imagine the story of the Titan included a resurrection narrative, something like this. Everyone knows the story of the Titan, the unsinkable British ship that embarked on its maiden voyage with 2,500 passengers. A marvel of engineering, the Titan was held as impervious to the forces of nature, cutting through the Atlantic at an impressive 25 knots. But one fateful night, 400 nautical miles from Newfoundland, it struck a towering iceberg. The collision ripped through its hull, sending the Titan and its passengers into the icy depths. For 3 days, the ship lay entombed beneath the waves, its tragic tale seemingly at an end. But then, a miraculous event unfolded. 2 angelic beings, radiant in white, hovered over the site. The sea churned, and the Titan, its iron hull mended, rose triumphantly from the depths. Along with it, the 2,500 souls who had perished returned to life, clothed in garments that shone like the sun. Witnesses watched in awe as the resurrected Titan sailed back to port, a divine testimony of triumph over death. Now compare this with the historical Titanic, a real ship that sank under tragically mundane circumstances. The parallels are striking, but the fictional resurrection of the Titan crosses into the realm of legend, just like the miraculous claims of the New Testament. It walks, talks, and acts like myth, and yet we're supposed to believe it's historical. The gospel writers weren't operating in a vacuum. They lived in a world teeming with legendary stories of men becoming gods, from cradle to grave and beyond. Sure, the details differ. Caesar's ascending to the heavens, Asclepius raising the dead, Bacchus torn apart and reborn, but the patterns remain the same. Invented eyewitnesses, miraculous events, and divine transformations were par for the course. Why should we treat the New Testament any differently? Even early Christians like Justin Martyr couldn't escape the similarities. Justin acknowledged them outright, but offered an imaginative explanation. Demons had preemptively mimicked Jesus' story to confuse people. In his first apology, he writes, "When we say that Jesus Christ was born of a virgin, crucified, died, and rose again, we propound nothing different from what you believe regarding those whom you esteem sons of Jupiter, Mercury, Asclepius, Bacchus, Hercules, Perseus, Bellerophon, of course, and even the emperors whom you deify." Justin knew the parallels were undeniable. He listed the sons of Jupiter and other divine figures as examples of stories remarkably similar to Jesus' life and death. But instead of recognizing the mythic pattern, he attributed the similarities to demonic plagiarism. Wicked devils perpetrated these things, and we have learned that those only are deified who have lived near to God in holiness and virtue. See, for Justin, the measure of truth wasn't historical credibility, but ethical and moral virtue, reflecting the philosophical trends of his day. Yet even his attempt to rationalize the similarities reveals just how deeply Christian stories were entangled with Greek and Roman myths. Let's be clear, the New Testament doesn't stand apart from the legendary traditions of its time. It fits neatly into a broader cultural context of myths and folklore. The Greeks had Heracles, who ascended to Olympus. The Romans had Caesar, whose soul was seen rising to the heavens from a funeral pyre. Even Asclepius was credited with raising the dead. These stories were so common that Lucian of Samosata, a sharp critic of gullibility, mocked the tendency to inflate ordinary men into gods. What begins as a man's tale of daring grows into a legend of impossible deeds, until the hero is no longer a man, but a god. Sound familiar? It should. The pattern of elevating mortal men to divine status was alive and well in the ancient world, and the Gospels fit right in. The Apologists' eyewitness hill is a desperate defense against the obvious. Invented eyewitnesses were standard practice for bolstering miraculous claims. The Caesars had them, Asclepius had them, and Jesus? No exception. The world the Gospels were written in was already full of similar stories, and they followed the same patterns. If we take eyewitness claims of one of these serious, then we should do the same of the others. Yeah, some might be invented and fictive, others might be based on delusion or some other dream-like, vision-like experience, and we have ways we rationalize this. But treating one as if it's true and historical, and all the others as if they are not, is inconsistent, falling into that special pleading kind of category. But here's the question. If the Gospels walk like legend, talk like legend, and act like legend, why should we believe they're anything but legend? As Just a Martyr inadvertently showed, the Gospel narratives share the same DNA as the myths and folklore of their time. The Apologists may cry foul, but even they can't escape the reality that Jesus' story fits neatly into the mythic tradition of the ancient world. Let's not lose sight of the impressive parallels in these historical coincidences that apologists love to pull up. Let's also be honest. None of them are extraordinary in the way the Gospels' claims are. The analogy of the Titan and Titanic? Grounded in real-world events. Ships sink. This is something we can point to repeatedly throughout history. Look at the parallels between presidents. For example, Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy, elected to Congress in 1846, and then elected to Congress in 1946, elected as president in 1860, elected as president in 1960. Lincoln was known for his efforts to end the slavery, Emancipation Proclamation. Kennedy supported the Civil Rights Movement and worked together toward social equality. One was assassinated on Friday, the same with the other. Shot in Ford's theater, shot in Lincoln automobile made by Ford. Assassination was John Wilkes Booth, 3 names, 15 letters. Assassination was Lee Harvey Oswald, 3 names, 15 letters. Succeeded by Andrew Johnson, born in 1808, succeeded by Lyndon B. Johnson, born in 1908. Wife was present at his assassination, wife was present at his assassination. Shot in the head, shot in the head. These are remarkable coincidences, yes, but they don't involve the miraculous. These kinds of parallels, though interesting, don't strengthen the historical case for the Gospels. Why? Because the elements they share, ships sinking or leaders sharing quirks, are rooted in things that actually happen in the real world. You'll notice the same pattern with examples like The Simpsons predicting Trump's presidency in 2000. You do know that Donald Trump was being interviewed around that period, and it was a sensational question people were asking. Do you see yourself, this rich man, ever running for presidency? Very patriotic person. He would mention these in interviews. So is it ironic that it shows up in a Simpson episode?
Percent of what they're making. It's a joke.
This sounds like political presidential talk to me, and I know people have talked to you about whether or not you want to run. Would you ever?
Probably not, but I do get tired of seeing the country ripped off.
Why would you not?
I just don't think I really have the inclination to do it. I love what I'm doing. I really like it.
Also, it doesn't pay as well.
No, it doesn't. But, I just probably wouldn't do it, Oprah. I probably wouldn't, but I do get tired of seeing what's happening with this country. And if it got so bad, I would never want to rule it out totally.
Or Edgar Allan Poe's The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, 1838. Which eerily foreshadowed a real-life cannibalized boy named Richard Parker decades later. These are coincidences shaped by realistic expectations or trends, not claims of divine miracles. Contrast these with the New Testament claims: virgins giving birth, heroes commanding the weather, walking on water, multiplying food, turning water into wine, glowing on mountaintops alongside ancient figures, dying and rising from the dead days later and ascending into the clouds. These aren't coincidences or even plausible events. They're legends, pure and simple. Here's where it gets ironic. I used to believe all of this, and I'll admit, I once found it convincing. But when I try to step back and put myself in the believer's shoes again, I notice an inconsistency. Believers refuse to take other miraculous stories seriously, the very ones that resemble their own claims. They label me a skeptic, closed off to divine intervention, while applying the same amount of skepticism to every god and hero except theirs. To avoid the charge of special pleading, apologists try to anchor the gospel accounts in history, real people, places, and events. This tactic is supposed to make the miraculous claims seem more plausible. But this is hardly unique to the New Testament. Historical anchoring is a hallmark of legends and myths across cultures. The Caesars? Same thing. Alexander the Great? Same thing. Legendary figures are constantly woven into historical settings to give their stories credibility. The same is true of Apollonius of Tyana and various other figures. Let's be clear, the uphill battle here isn't just mine, it's history's. The ancients themselves were in on the act, associating historical figures with myths of old. This wasn't a coincidence, it was intentional. Their heroes didn't just exist in history, they had to reflect the gods. This is why you might find Mark Antony dressed as Dionysus, or you might find later Caesars emulating Romulus, the mythical founder of Rome, or you might find Jesus and other figures imitating or looking like Moses in their literary works. These legends, historical people, mixed the mythic in with the historical, and this was a big no-no in the eyes of serious thinkers like Cicero, like Thucydides, like Lucian. Imagine a bustling city. Someone steps into a phone booth. Moments later, they rip open their shirt, revealing a superhero costume. With a dramatic leap, they soar into the sky, cape trailing behind them, off to fight villains and save the day. Everyone knows this is a fiction. The signs are obvious: extraordinary powers, a dramatic transformation, and a destiny far beyond the ordinary. Now imagine someone hundreds of years later insisting that this actually happened. They argue that because the phone booth existed, the hero must have too. They point to eyewitnesses who swear they saw him take off. This isn't just implausible, it's the exact problem we face with the Gospels. The parallels between Jesus and other legendary figures aren't accidental. They follow the same tropes: extraordinary births, miraculous deeds, and divine ascensions, all woven into a historical backdrop for credibility. Apologists cry association fallacy. But here's the truth. The ancients themselves associated their historical heroes with mythic patterns. If you take Caesar Augustus, written and deified, made into a legend even while he was still alive in the works of Ovid, giving him miraculous births, he's a deified emperor, walking, living God among many people who worshipped him. My point is this: it doesn't take but a night or two for a legend to spring up and people invent these patterns of human characters. This is exactly what we find with Peregrinus and the descriptions that Lucian gives about how they made men into gods. It was almost immediate, especially when Lucian describes the event of the phoenix or falcon flying out of the flames of Peregrinus ascending to Olympus. He invents this story, and the next day, after telling the story to many travelers on the road, the next day an old wise man with confidence said he saw with his own eyes the falcon and phoenix ascending to heaven. Notice how quick, within one day, you already have the legend solidified and the story passed along. The New Testament isn't unique in this sense. It's a masterpiece of myth-making within a historical framework. No different from the tales of Alexander, the Caesars, or Heracles. When you step back and look at the extraordinary claims objectively, the signs are obvious. This isn't history. It's a story crafted to inspire and elevate. And once you see it, truly, you cannot unsee it. The ancient world was filled with its own superheroes, each brimming with the same markers of fiction we recognize today. Heracles, or Hercules, was the demigod son of Zeus and a mortal woman, renowned for his incredible strength and legendary labors, from slaying the Nemean lion to capturing the golden hind of Artemis. Achilles, born of a mortal father and a sea goddess, was nearly invincible, except for his infamous hill. His tragic death in the Trojan War cemented his place in mythic lore. Romulus, the founder of Rome, was said to be the son of Mars, the god of war, and after his mysterious death, he ascended to the heavens, becoming a god. These myths didn't just belong to fictional characters. They were often tied to historical figures, elevating them into legends that blurred the lines between reality and divinity. Take Alexander the Great. His story was legendary from the moment he was born. His mother Olympias claimed Zeus himself fathered him, appearing in the form of a serpent. On the night of his birth, the temple of Artemis burned, a divine omen that a godlike figure had arrived. Even as a boy, Alexander was exceptional when he tamed the wild horse Bucephalus, a feat no one else could achieve. It was seen as a sign he was destined for greatness. Egypt's oracle declared him the son of Amun, and Alexander carried this divine validation as he marched undefeated across the ancient world. He cut the Gordian knot, defeated armies with supernatural precision, and reshaped the known world, as if the gods themselves fought alongside him. Even in death, Alexander's story transcended mortality. Legends claim his body didn't decay, a sure sign of divinity, and tales of his exploits grew larger over time, featuring mythical creatures, divine encounters, and fulfilled prophecies. Alexander wasn't just a historical figure, he became a mythic archetype, ensuring his name echoed through the ages as both man and god. Caesar Augustus wasn't just Rome's first emperor, he was its chosen one, a man whose life was framed as divinely guided from the start. Born Gaius Octavius, his rise was accompanied by omens predicting a ruler who would bring peace and prosperity to the world. As adopted son of Julius Caesar, who was later deified, Augustus carried the title Son of a God. Poets like Virgil immortalized him in works like the Aeneid, portraying Augustus as the fulfillment of prophecy, a savior ushering in Rome's golden age under the divine favor of Jupiter. Statues and coins depicted him as eternally youthful, godlike in appearance. Even his death was surrounded by mystique. Some claimed he was carried to the heavens, completing the arc of a man already worshipped as a living deity. Augustus wasn't just an emperor, he was Rome's divine gift, crafted into a figure of eternal significance. Then there's Apollonius of Tyana, a first-century philosopher, whose life reads like a myth, written to rival the gods. Born around the same time as Jesus, his story begins with divine signs and a heavenly being announcing his extraordinary birth. Apollonius became a wandering sage, healer, and miracle worker, performing feats that sound strikingly similar. He cast out demons, healed the sick, and even raised the dead, earning a reputation as a divine figure. Legends claim he calmed storms, predicted the future, and could even appear in multiple places at once. And when his life came to an end, Apollonius didn't simply die, he ascended to heaven or mysteriously disappeared, leaving his followers in awe. After his death, his cult grew, temples were erected in his honor, and his story blurred the line between man and myth. Apollonius became the ancient world's answer to a superhero, a historical figure elevated to divine status through legend and lore. The Jewish traditions also share these mythic patterns. Take Moses, for example. His miraculous rescue as an infant echoes the ancient story of Sargon of Akkad, who was similarly saved from death in a basket on a river. Moses goes on to part the sea with a wave of his hand, summon plagues upon Egypt, and bring manna from heaven to sustain his people. Then there's Elijah, who bypasses death altogether by ascending to heaven in a fiery chariot, a story brimming with the supernatural. Now fast forward to the New Testament, Jesus leaps from its pages bearing the same legendary hallmarks. Born of a virgin through divine conception, heralded by angels and a guiding star, he performs miracles, walking on water, multiplying loaves to feed thousands, raising the dead, and meets a dramatic end, only to rise again and ascend into heaven. Every page of the Gospel signals that we're dealing with storytelling, not history. Just as we instinctively know the superhero stepping out of the phone booth is fiction, We could see the same signs in the tales of Alexander the Great, Caesar Augustus, Apollonius of Tyana, and yes, Jesus. Extraordinary births, miraculous deeds, and supernatural endings are the universal trademarks of legend, crafted to inspire and elevate, not to document historical reality. Lucian of Samosata provides a telling lens for understanding this dynamic. He famously remarked how easily Christians of his time were exploited by charismatic figures like Peregrinus Proteus, describing Christians as gullible people easily deceived. Peregrinus Proteus was a man whose life epitomized the blending of myth, philosophy, and religion. Born under the aura of divine favor, some even claimed he was a son of Zeus. He gained prominence in the early Christian movement, where he became a pivotal leader, writing Christian texts and inspiring unwavering devotion. When imprisoned and seen as a potential martyr, Christians rallied around him, treating him like a living god, a new Socrates. They showered him with gifts, loyalty, and reverence. But Peregrinus wasn't content to stay within Christianity. Embracing the Cynic philosophy later in life, he renounced worldly ties to pursue radical virtue. His death became the stuff of legend. During the Olympic Games, Peregrinus threw himself onto a blazing pyre. Witnesses claimed they saw his soul rise to heaven in the form of a phoenix. To add to the drama, an earthquake shook the ground at the moment of his passing, as if the earth itself acknowledged his fiery transcendence. In life and death, Peregrinus embodied the mythic archetype, a man who blurred the line between philosophy, faith, and divinity. His followers elevated him to a status that mirrored the legendary heroes and gods of antiquity, like Heracles and Zeus. Let's not sugarcoat it. Lucian of Samosata was not a fan of Peregrinus. In fact, he savaged this so-called philosopher for his immoral behavior and egotistical antics. Peregrinus' story serves as a fascinating lens through which Lucian critiques both charlatans and the gullibility of early Christians. After detailing Peregrinus' shady past, Lucian delivers this blistering assessment. It was then that he learned the wondrous lore of the Christians by associating with their priests and scribes in Palestine. And how else could it be? In a trice, he made them all look like children. For he was prophet, cult leader, head of the synagogue, and everything, all by himself. He interpreted and explained some of their books and even composed many, and they revered him as a god. Next after that other, to be sure, whom they still worship, the man who was crucified in Palestine, because he introduced this new cult into the world. Lucian's sharp wit lays bare the early Christian propensity to exalt charismatic figures even to the point of deification. He continues, "Then at length Proteus was apprehended for this and thrown into prison, which itself gave him no little reputation. Aged widows and orphan children could be seen waiting near the prison, while their officials even slept inside with him after bribing the guards. Then elaborate meals were brought in, and sacred books of theirs were read aloud, and excellent Peregrinus was called by them the new Socrates." The Christians' devotion, while admirable in their sincerity, provided ample opportunity for exploitation. Peregrinus leveraged their faith for personal gain, receiving money, lavish meals, and widespread support. Lucian, ever the cynic, skewers their credulity. So if any charlatan and trickster able to profit by occasions comes among them, he quickly acquires sudden wealth by imposing upon simple folk. Lucian's critique highlights the danger of confusing fiction with history. The Christians revered Peregrinus as a living saint, but Lucian exposes him as a self-serving fraud. This is a microcosm of a larger issue, treating legendary and mythic narratives as literal truth. Imagine if Lucian actually knew Jesus or Paul. What would he have to say? What if we were to get another side of these guys from people who weren't cult followers of these teachers. The New Testament is like finding literature only written by the cynic devotees of Heracles instead of their opponents. What are we missing? These are not cleverly devised myths, as some would suppose. Well, who are those that suppose the Gospels, the New Testament stories, are cleverly devised myths? Let's step back for a moment. If we're to believe the Gospels, we're asked to accept that Jesus was born of a virgin, performed countless miracles, died, resurrected, and ascended into heaven. These are extraordinary claims. Yet outside of mythical, legendary, or fictive accounts, where are the real-world examples of divine births, miraculous deeds, and heavenly ascensions? They simply don't exist. And no, pointing to mundane coincidences like the Titan and Titanic, or parallels between presidents, doesn't bolster the case for the miraculous. Those coincidences are rooted in real-world plausibilities, not in the fantastical claims of resurrection or divine conception. In this series to come, I'll explore the various New Testament episodes involving Jesus and highlight the significant parallels to known stories from antiquity. These parallels often overlap so clearly that they seem to be the very inspirations for the gospel accounts. Yes, some scholars associate them as the literary inspiration for the Bible's story. Let me be clear. I'm not here to die on the hill of genetic connections. If a serious scholar stakes a claim on a direct link between Jesus' story and an earlier myth, I'll present it. But whether or not the connections are genetic, the patterns indicating its genre are unmistakable. If it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, flies like a duck, and smells like a duck, then let's face it, it's most likely a duck. The Gospels, like so many ancient narratives, follow the patterns of myth and legend. Lucian's critique of Heracles only underscores this tendency. Humans are drawn to extraordinary tales, elevating figures from the mundane to the divine. Question is, why should we treat the New Testament differently?